Welcome to the October 25th study session of the Planning Commission. We're here to discuss development in Lakewood, and we're gonna what I think I'd like to do is there's 5 items that have been brought up in the joint study session we had with City Council, and what followed up with the open houses on this. We've been receiving input from citizens both at the open houses and online, and what we'd like to do, or what I'd like to do, unless anybody has an objection, is take the 5 subject areas that staff has put together a little presentation on, or a write-up. These are raw comments, they're not edited. So let's try and make some sense of this and things we've noticed at meetings that maybe some of the ordinances aren't working the way we thought it would work. So with that, are there any general comments from anyone before we get started? Well, then let's start right off the bat with parking, because what we're going to do is we're going to try and prioritize these and figure out which of these, all of them, most of them, some of them should be a subject of future study sessions. We can have one study session each, or we can combine. We have a lot of flexibility as to how we proceed. So does anybody have anything to start off with regarding parking? Well, then I'll just start off by saying one of the things I've heard a lot about is the 0.75 parking spaces per unit in multifamily, and I think it's appropriate in certain circumstances when you're trying to encourage modes of transportation other than automobile, but a large part of the city it may not be, and that's something I think we should study and look at. And are there other areas in parking that people have noticed that? Johan,
I picked 3 categories of parking that I tried to grasp from the comments and also from the clusters that the staff had put together. I find that there's an overflow, what I call overflow in residential areas, and I should point out these really impact different parts of the city. The overflow into adjacent residences, the schools, the parking around schools, particularly high schools, and then finally a cluster of concerns around multifamily housing, even multifamily where parking is provided. I think there was some scatter there about the presence of large structures, but those 3 areas were the ones that I divided. Now, you know, there's enough comment even within parking and within housing to really bring up some more categories, but those were the 3s that I centered on.
Is there a consensus here that we ought to be looking at the parking ordinance and certain aspects of the parking ordinance?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, the microphone's off. There was a complaint, multiple complaints about too much parking in here too. About you know, if you go to a typical King Soopers or whatever, most people think it's crowded, there's not enough parking, but then there's always excess parking on the periphery areas, and it's not like there's not enough parking. In fact, King Supers or whatever it is, there's usually even too much, and it's just that people are not willing to, they want to park right outside the store, and there's that. And then I've heard comments about, you know, there was people complaining about that cars should not be allowed to be parked on a public street overnight in a single family residence. I don't know if that's legal to, like, say you can't park overnight.
Well, those are things I think if we want to have staff look into. I guess that's the question. What do we want staff to look at before our study session on parking?
I have a comment or two. Oh,
Yeah, so do I. No,
go ahead, Glenda.
Oh, thanks. So in our packet, again, as you've identified, there's 5 different pieces. However, in prioritizing the number of comments, housing received, like there are, 15 pages of housing comments. And so even though parking came first in our packet, I would think the volume of comments in the housing would then say, let's go there heaviest first.
Yeah, this is not in any priority order. It's just
Okay.
in the order it was presented, so that's
Yeah,
right.
and then the second was site design. There were 9 pages there with site design. Mixed use had 8 pages. And then parking and architectural design had the same number, 5 pages. And so as we think about prioritizing and what we want to tackle first, I would think housing. I understand we're just going through the packet right now, but it's kind of hard for me to say, yes, let's look into this with parking when housing is like the...
Well, we're not going to, the last portion of the meeting, the last 45 to an hour, we're going to spend trying to zero in on prioritizing.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else?
Oh,
Dale? Let's give Dale a chance.
It's okay. I noticed that on the map where there, and the map actually is very useful. I should tell whoever put that together where the complaints and what's favorable. I thought that was really helpful. The complaints principally are about parking are in northeast Lakewood. Except in the other areas where there's too much parking, but I mean, I know we like to have ordinances and guidelines that govern across Lakewood, but I could indicate that there's in some areas that have specific kinds of problems. You know, even in the Belmar area where there's a lot more density, people were saying, generally comments seem to say that there was plenty of parking.
Yep, and there's only problems in specific areas.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That was one thing I wanted to mention. Pardon me. The other was there were 5 recommendations about areas that you might research or that staff might research, and I didn't understand the lower maximum number of cars on single-family lots. The last one.
Which page?
Oh, I'm sorry. We're on page 7.
Page 7.
Currently in the zoning ordinance, you are allowed to store 7 cars on your single-family lot out in the open. And we've heard a lot of complaints and a lot of interest in lowering that number of cars that you can store on your single-family lot.
Is that related to the parking issue?
It's in the parking ordinance, or is it?
Is it like
fair enough.
7 cars out in the open on the property or on the public street?
So on the property, one thing that we need to be clear is the zoning ordinance doesn't regulate the street.
Yeah.
So regardless of comments we've heard, we can't through the zoning ordinance allow or deny parking on the street.
Mm-hmm. That's a traffic regulation.
Are citizens able to go to the traffic department and get something like that changed?
Well, so that's the discussion that's been happening both around Lakewood High School and around the Sun Point residential development in Ward 3, and there are difficulties with that. Part of it is, if you put no parking on one block, it pushes it to another block. So it's just moving the problem around, and so they're hesitant to do no parking. Although, they're open to ideas. They've looked around Lakewood High at time of day parking at minimum or at maximum number of hours at a time, different things like that. But that is the answer. It's not in the zoning code. So it's not something that we can solve in this process.
How many complaints were there about the number of cars on single-family lots?
It's something that we hear occasionally and have heard.
There wasn't actually any in here, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was anything that came up at the open house. It's just a regular comment that we hear from the public and occasionally from council members.
And as long as we're adjusting zoning code, we might as well look at that, I suppose.
Well, and we'll discuss these sorts of things in more detail. But one of the issues that comes up whenever we look at these things is what's appropriate in every place in the city. And you can have a single family, in a small lot zone that is different than if you're in an area that has a large lot that there may I don't know any specifics, but there may be places in the city where 7 cars on a lot are not appropriate. I don't know.
It's not actually cars, isn't it?
Or vehicles.
Trailers,
Yeah.
cars, RVs, boats, all those things. Yeah. Okay. We could leave it on there, but those add up pretty fast, actually,
Well,
for people who have, like in a suburban area like this, for people who have a camper and
So
a boat.
we're looking for your guidance on this. If something like that isn't worth our time compared to the other things in this packet, then we'd love your guidance on what we should drop off this list. Certainly, we've got enough to do.
I put a note by it because I thought, looking at the whole packet and that we have 6 weeks or 8 weeks of these things, my feeling was that this was really low priority. And I've never heard anybody complain. I didn't hear any complaint. This was their citizens' chance to complain about whatever was, and some of the complaints were about whatever they felt, and we didn't hear one. So I would say, I don't want to spend our time on it.
Well, I've heard complaints about parking at ward meetings, and
I was going to say in Ward 1, parking in general has been a big issue in Ward 1, specifically because of Brewski's.
Oh, I understand
And
that.
so I would add to Johan's list of things to look at the restaurant parking as well.
Yeah.
Because I've actually heard it quite a bit about the kind of outside parking for Colorado Mills, where all the restaurants are, that doesn't have enough parking. I've heard that quite a bit, and I don't disagree with it. It's always kind of a challenge. But I kind of agree with Glenda, though. I think parking is something that we should obviously talk about, but I think it'll be probably pretty low on the priority list.
I guess Applewood, there's a restaurant,
Yes,
or a
that's
couple
Brewski's.
restaurants in Applewood that don't have enough parking, and that we should look into. Did they meet code, and so there's a problem with the code, or were they not in conformance with the code?
I think what would be helpful for us for input from you all is if you go to page 7 of the
Yeah, I was just going to do that and then move on to the next one.
and tell us which of these to keep, which of these to move forward with, and are there additional ones, as well as any detail within any of these that we should pay attention to.
So, the 5 items listed under parking, we'll go through those and then throw out anything in addition that we ought to look at. And remember, we're going to talk about prioritizing parking and where it fits in the whole thing at the end. So,
Could I contribute something to the discussion at this point? I know that we don't, on-street parking is somewhat outside of our province. But the citizens don't make that fine distinction. If we really think there ought to be some amendments to the municipal code, which is, that gets outside of our property really, we can still make recommendations to City Council or ACIC that we're looking at this part of it, you guys look at that part of it. And because there are some ordinances that do apply to on-street parking. How long you can keep an RV there and other vehicles perhaps. I haven't looked at it recently. But I was looking at the present zoning ordinance, 1781, parking standards. And I did see some focus on the minimum standards, particularly that one of 0.75 space per unit on multi-family dwelling. That seemed to be a subject that in conversation, perhaps less so in the written comments, that people were focusing on. I think there was a kind of almost not really an understanding of what that means, but it might be interesting to investigate as to how those minimum standards are actually impacting and whether we ought to be looking at them. Because I also see group residential facility came up, and that's 0.25 spaces per bedroom, and yet there seems to be a concern about clusters, not only of visitors to group facilities, but also service providers that have to park there. And but I don't know what the reality of it is. A lot of people don't build to the minimum standards, and but perhaps that's something that we need to look at anyway in terms of experience.
So with that, what I'd like to do is talk very briefly about these recommendations we got from planning, and see if we agree with those. Do we want to add anything? Do we want to take anything out? So I'll just read them and then just chime in where you think it's appropriate. Modified requirements for multifamily parking, that's the 0.75 units per, and modified requirements for restaurant parking, that's deals with
You want us
some of
to
the other
comment about
problems.
each of them? As
Well, I'm going to read them, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion about where you think we're at with the priorities of parking. Creation of new requirements for electric vehicles, that's something I noticed there were some comments on. Expansion and modification of bicycle parking requirements. Again, if we want to become more sustainable, that's obviously an area that some are concerned with. And then lower maximum number of cars in single-family lots. So we discussed all these. Do we agree that when we have the session, if we in fact decide we're going to have a session on parking, that these are the items that staff should be looking at? Is there anything else they should be looking at?
Well, I have a comment, but I don't think we should spend our time on the last one, the lower maximum from a single-family lot. I think there's enough other things to look at. Following up on Johan's comment, I had made a note too about in the summary of this section, slightly more than half of the people completing the online questionnaire had concerns about development not having enough parking, and I was wondering if there's any other sort of data. I know this is what you would look for, but data that supports that, and I don't know what that would look like. Yes, surveys, drive-bys, looking for cars parked on the street rather than in lots. Or
One of the things that we will do for this parking section is, some parking counts. So we've already identified a number of residential buildings, especially for that residential multifamily, and we're going to do some counts, daytime, nighttime, and see what the parking counts are, especially on newer projects.
Okay, so you're talking about collecting your own data.
Yep.
Okay.
That we'll bring to you.
Great.
Yep.
That'd be good. The rest of these, I'm in favor of.
And the only thing, just make sure we add Johann's comment, like that we can kick that on-street public street parking to the traffic department or to the city council.
Yeah, those issues come up periodically.
Yep.
And I think ACIC has looked at on-street parking 2 or 3 different times in recent years. So, and they have made some recommendations to council, and there have been some ordinance revisions, if I recall correctly.
Maybe.
You know, I think especially on recreational vehicles.
Yeah, parking and transportation is something I think comes up in just about everything that comes before us.
Traffic.
There's the thing about the electric vehicles, new requirements for electric vehicles, I don't think that should be on the list.
I agree.
Well,
Because we don't put gas stations at a parking spot at the moment.
Yeah, but if you're trying to encourage
Electric vehicles.
electric vehicles, that's something maybe,
That's policy.
yeah.
well, the problem is that electric vehicle recharging stations are part of infrastructure development in parking areas. And I'm afraid I would have to disagree. I think there is, especially with our sustainability thrust,
Okay.
some of that ought to be in our zoning ordinance in terms of parking requirements of new facilities. And
Yeah, is that
I
number,
think,
is that number one priority? I don't think so, but I think it's high enough priority we ought to look at it.
Commercial developments, because if
Well,
I was a commercial enterprise and I wanted people to come to my establishment, I would offer.
you know, it's an interesting point. I'd say commercial and multifamily.
I wonder if we could refine this, instead of it saying creation of new requirements, but creation of charging stations for electric vehicles, because that's really what we're after, right?
Well, I guess that's where we're at the discussion. Are we solely looking at ordinance changes, zoning ordinance changes, or are we also looking at recommendations, larger recommendations based on, the input here and the input we've had at ward meetings and at our public hearings? You don't need to answer now, but think about that when we get towards the end of the meeting. But
I have a comment about the electric vehicles. I'm not too worried, Glenda, about the wording creation of new requirements, but I mean, I think that's just a way of putting it on the list. I think it is looking forward. It's an important thing to have on the list. I mean, ready or not, here they come. Actually, I mean, China has set a date of 2030 to be all electric in the cars that they produce. That's not very far away. And if we're thinking about regulations that are going to be up, how long do we look for these to be in place? 15 years, 10 maybe. Even then, we're pretty close to that. And I think we don't want to be caught as a city, sort of with our unprepared for people that want to bring electric vehicles to Lakewood or live with electric vehicles, and it does seem like as a part of commercial buildings and multifamily, perhaps there could be some something to look into, and so that's I would like to see staff research that for us.
okay, let's move on to housing, and rather than make recommendations right now to planning staff, I want to go through each item so that may adjust our priorities as we go through items, because we got to keep in mind, there's only a certain amount of time we have to look at these things. But I think that was a good discussion to get us started. But let's look at housing now, and housing is the one item that I think everything that's been being discussed in the city right now revolves around. You had
I just wanted to close the loop on the parking stuff before you go on. Just wanted to make sure I got the right notes. Was there a consensus beyond Commissioner Miller to drop the last?
No, we'll make that decision at the end.
We'll come back to it.
Yes,
Okay.
we'll come back to it.
That seems like an inefficient way to go forward. Why don't we just
Yeah,
look at
let's
these?
finish the
Because
conversation.
we're gonna expand the number of study sessions we have to,
Right.
I mean, to cover the things that we feel are important.
Yeah, but,
I think we'd like to close that one out.
okay.
Yeah, I would like to check them off as we go. It's gonna take longer to go back through them again.
Okay. Well, then, where are we at? Is the consensus to move forward with everything? I have to go back to.
Okay. There's, I don't know where this would fit, Travis. Sorry, Mr. Parker. But there was a lot of complaints about unsafe, they don't feel safe in restaurant parking, that's fine. But also tying that in with the environment, the parking environment, like the treescapes and landscaping and stuff. That's all, I guess that's neither restaurant or multifamily. At King Supers is commercial. So it should be modified requirements for multifamily, restaurant, or just residential and commercial, as opposed to instead of multifamily and restaurant, but residential and commercial.
So the intent from our perspective of these first two recommendations was to look at the number, the number of spaces we're requiring.
Mhm.
If you're asking us to look at lighting and landscaping, I think we had another recommendation on here to look at parking lot light. Is that the request?
Yeah, because there were a lot of complaints about
Okay.
unsafe parking and
And we can do that generally, not just for multifamily or commercial. We can look at the lighting and landscaping
Yeah.
requirements for parking lots.
that's the only thing I would add.
Okay.
So, we're gonna look at modified requirements for residential parking. Focus on multifamily, but residential parking.
Okay.
Modified requirements for commercial parking with emphasis on restaurant, because that's where a lot of the complaints have been. Is the consensus to look at requirements for electric vehicles? Yes,
I
no?
say yes.
I mean, I like it, but it's just requirements for electric vehicles is just a little too broad and vague for me.
I'd be curious, because the one thing I was curious about, like and this is something to bring to the next time we discuss this, but like, how does that work? If you have something at a residential place, is it set up so that only the residents can use it? Or is it something that people pay to charge there? Or I don't know how they have that set up, because I don't have an electric car. So I'd be curious to hear more about what the options are for
Yeah,
that.
Free,
I think,
it'll be more paid in the future.
We can research
that'd be my
that.
guess. Because right now it's
Yeah,
pretty
I
much
bet-
just a free thing.
yeah, I think that's part of what we look into.
Right.
What's common practice? What's
Mhm.
what are others doing in this area? Are we
Mhm.
We'll do it.
Because I do think that it would be good to have that encouraged, at least for new residential buildings.
Absolutely.
And my thought is, since I don't want to, I know we're not taking confessions this evening, but I've had my daughter's hybrid periodically, just to store it temporarily. And I must say it's a little bit like having a pet. It can be plugged into a house circuit. Takes a long time to charge that way, but it comes with a charging kit. On the other hand, if I were to imagine myself living in an apartment complex, it would be nice to have a few of the parking areas with charging stations. I don't know that everyone has to have one. Similarly, I see that certain large retail establishments have a couple of areas where you can plug in a car. And so it's part of the market out there. But we might kind of look and
So this
see
is-
whether it's practical to put it in. It is a wave of the future.
This is residential and commercial
Right.
then.
And I have an electric car, and so I can speak to some of this, and I think it's worth looking at when we get there. I think it's some of the comments were misunderstood what it means, and it doesn't mean to provide free charging for cars and that
Yeah.
kind of thing, and
It's
we can
not
get
gonna
beyond
be,
that.
well, it's not free now, really, but
Never- yeah.
it's not gonna be free in terms of charging
No.
stations.
I think that this is about infrastructure and
Right,
making it possible. Just like that's like plumbing,
It's true.
sewer, and water.
Although there's something to be said about, you know, the investment in that sort of thing, because it cleans the environment, but that's a stretch.
Oh, it's not much of a stretch, really. I mean, part of our sustainability plan has goals to reduce the amount of carbon, and I think that this is one of those ordinances that we could modify that would support that goal in our sustainability plan.
You know, yeah, that's what I was saying, that we should at least think about incentivizing people to use electric cars.
Oh, that would go even beyond this. Yeah,
So,
yeah,
anyway,
I agree.
expansion of bicycle parking, I think everybody agrees we should be looking at that. Lower maximum number of cars on single-family lots, that's the one that, should we drop it? Should we include it?
I think the misunderstanding about this is that it says cars, but it means
Vehicles.
a trailer and a boat and an RV and
Okay.
all of that. And the smallest trailer counts as one of these, and there's a lot of.
I think you can drop it since the concern is about on-street parking.
This,
Well, there were a couple items, there were a couple people complained about their neighbors have too many cars, but is that a citywide problem, or is that a neighbor-to-neighbor problem?
it's,
I also wonder about the enforcement. Can you speak just generally to that, how it would be enforced?
So code enforcement takes complaints,
Mm.
and they go out and they count vehicles.
Mhm.
if I could comment, this has been a thicket almost every time it comes up. There's some neighborhoods where people have parked on grassy areas in the front yard, which is against ordinance now. People who are annoyed by a lot of cars in the driveway. It's hard for me to come to a conclusion on that.
Yeah, this would,
Because it's,
this would come into play, just like, okay, your weeds are too high, or, you're not maintaining your property. It'd be complaint driven, and then,
or people who gravel their front yards and park cars there, or vehicles there.
well, I think that's committed, or permitted.
Yes.
I guess I'm thinking in part someone like myself who has 3 children who are all driving at the same time and each had a car. And then my wife and I had a car, and then there's a boat and a camper. And suddenly we have 7 vehicles. It doesn't look crowded. There's no vehicles up on blocks, but I think that's not allowed anyway.
Yeah, there was a time, I think, counting a trailer that I did have 7 vehicles.
I
Not
know I
not in Colorado, but in a previous life.
I guess I'm thinking that sometimes we think of vehicles being up on blocks and that sort of thing as what this is about, and I don't know. I don't see it as a big problem, and I'd see people pushing back on that.
Well,
anyway.
the other thing is,
I would.
it's the same thing. So many of us have temporary situations. If you have people for Thanksgiving, and your whole neighborhood has people for Thanksgiving. Well, usually we can work that out, but.
Well, the argument could be made that, what people do on their private property, what businesses it are, is how many vehicles they park, as long as they're not violating any other ordinance that relates to, maintenance of your property, which I could see maybe some over parking might affect things that are covered by other ordinance. But anyway,
I guess my thought was I didn't think this was important enough for us to.
well,
The other thing is, though, there is a little spillover here between the people who are complaining about university and higher ed, where people in the neighborhood may be renting houses and having the old unrelated persons living together dilemma that come and park a lot of cars. So I'll mention that in passing. I don't, again, it's a slippery issue to try to catch on to.
Yeah, I guess I think we ought to, if we have time, discuss it and not drop it off, but it's not a priority, I don't think. So, when we, at the end, decide, okay, when we're gonna cover these issues, if your input is there's not enough time to study these, then maybe it'll drop off then. But right now, let's just leave it in as a.
I thought there was already consensus that we drop it.
Oh, was there? I heard it's mixed.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely mixed.
Leave it on.
I think there's two leave it on, there's two leave it off, and two, I don't know.
Leave it on if I don't know what category I was placed in, but
Yes,
I
yeah.
say, leave it on.
We're
Oh.
consensing.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I'm glad you brought it up because
Safety combined kind of thing.
because I've heard in other places, concern about the safety of parking at night, particularly in the in things like Belmar, the garages, but other places too. Okay, let's.
It's 7:15.
Yes.
Meat of it. Housing.
Yes, we'll go on to housing now. And there's so much here. I think we'll be here all night unless on this one we probably should look at each of these recommendations and talk about it. Unless somebody disagrees.
I think it's a good idea. We have so many comments on the rest of these that I think if we just look at the recommendations about and just give them the go ahead or the.
Yeah, and then if anybody, I mean, we have experiences other than these comments, and I do need to point out these are comments of a very small percentage of people. They're people who tend to care more about their issues and care more about the city, but they are a small percentage. And we have to look at the bigger picture and how you get everybody's input other than through our own experiences and discussions with people and things that come up at public hearings. We have to factor that in here somehow too. But with that in mind, let's go through planning department's recommendations and see if we want to keep them in, take them out, and then when we get through this, is there anything else we want to add? Okay, first one is research ways to encourage or require affordable housing throughout Lakewood. Now that's a hot topic because there's people who feel passionately that this is something we really need to resolve, and there's others that I've seen comments on social engineering. There's people that in the city don't think we should even be spending time on this. So, it's definitely something we need to look into and look at the modifications to ordinances aspect of this problem. We have a study now. Do we implement it? How do we implement it? So, anybody else have thoughts on that?
I don't think we should debate these right now. I'm just thinking we're sort of directing staff about what kinds of research we'd be interested in. So I made some notes about that.
Okay.
I was thinking about what is the housing stock in Lakewood. You may already know that. and also the distribution of affordable housing. I sort of get the sense that except in certain parts of Lakewood, there already is it's already pretty well distributed for affordable housing. I mean, a lot of but that would be useful to know. Again, one of your wonderful maps with highlights about those things. So, and also there are a lot of comments about affordable or not affordable without any or very much data. And so I was curious and was wondering about the how Lakewood prices compare to other places in the metro area for home sales and the condominium sales, and also rents for the rents of units along the higher density areas or the transit areas compared with other parts of the metro area. Those are those kind of facts seem like they would be how we could address this without and move ahead.
Just to piggyback on that, I wonder if housing for seniors is included in that affordable housing, because there were several comments about senior housing. So just as he asked about, where things are located, if we could add where housing for seniors, maybe low income and not low income housing as well. So,
Well, I don't know how many of you, I haven't read the housing study, but, I attended some of the sessions and have seen some of the conclusions, but just so everybody understands, low-income housing that we're looking at is, I mean, they listed a lot of the like teachers and nurses and people with full-time jobs can't afford the average cost of housing in the city if they move in, and that's really what I got out of the housing study we should focus on looking at when we talk about affordable housing.
but then too, I might add the Metro West housing, if they have any ideas about where they might expand in Lakewood in the future, if that could be researched or communicated from them through you to us.
We could probably also use some clarification on the terminology, subsidized housing versus affordable housing, and who it's really targeted for, that sort of thing. And I assume that within that housing stock report, it would separate the subsidized housing, or at least we'd have a sense of, by separate, I mean, so we'd know how much there is. Because I think that's what some people were talking about, was subsidized housing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think about having a very brief synopsis of what the housing study came up with at the session on housing? Or
I think that would probably be helpful.
Do we have anyone with skills to, when I look at the housing study, it's a daunting study. One of the things that it doesn't do, though, is to do a big comparison with the rest of the metro area.
We can bring the
We
author
could
in
that,
to answer your questions if you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, then I guess consensus is yes. I mean, we could have a presentation that takes up the whole meeting, or we can have a 5-minute presentation. What scale? Where does it fit? And what you?
I kind of question how much we can do within the zoning code to really impact low-income housing, because we don't want to limit what people can do on their property too much to the point where it's not, worth it for them to develop it anymore. So that's kind of my big concern with this. Is this feels more like something that council should be really focusing on and figuring out grants and things like that. So I guess I'd be curious what our like, what could we even really add in there without causing problems down the road?
This is an issue where you're absolutely right. I think most of the viable solutions, if the policy was to encourage more housing in parts of the city where it's not, most of the viable solutions are probably not zoning code related.
Right.
So they'd be recommendations from you to the council to
Okay.
do things outside of zoning.
And they are also looking into this, aren't they? Or no?
They will be. I mean, this is going through you first. So whatever you guys
Yeah.
finish with, we'll go to them.
When we had our study session, you know, the process we're going through was kind of limited to zoning ordinances revisions. But it's been kind of expanded and sold as a discussion of development. So if we were looking at strictly zoning changes, no, we wouldn't
Okay.
spend much time on this. But I think we're looking at the broader issue. Do we have recommendations to city council in this area?
You know,
And actually, that is what we're doing here, right? Is we're just going through this and making recommendations to city council.
Yeah, and those recommendations, the majority of them probably will be recommendations to change the zoning code, but I can think of several areas that we might recommend some other things.
Right.
you know, meant to look this up today and I didn't, but we do have a public housing, I won't call it a commission, but we do have, this is a segment of city government, isn't it?
So we have Metro West Housing, which is Lakewood's housing authority.
Yeah, that's what
Yep.
that's what I'm grasping for, the housing authority.
Yep.
So there are some people who deal directly with this within city government, with affordable.
Yeah, they're outside of city government.
Oh, they are?
Yep,
Oh, okay.
they're separate now.
I should know that.
They
but
used to be part of the city
That's
government.
right, Okay.
You know something I'd like to see, whether it's part of this or elsewhere, is, when we go to those dinners, the number of commissions and agencies, and it's just mind-boggling. I'd like to have some understanding of where how many commissions we have and what their purpose is, because maybe part of our recommendation might be, hey, the so-and-so commission should be considering this or something. I don't know. But even if that's not the case, boy, it'd be nice to understand a little more about how the city operates.
One of the
This is about
things,
zoning, right? So,
Well,
what can zoning do to deal with the issues of affordable housing and so on? I mean, like,
well, that's what we just discussed.
Yeah.
That if we were looking at just zoning ordinance changes, we might not be spending a lot of time on this. But
and if
this is one of the hot topics that keeps getting brought up. That if we ought to at least look at some of the issues around that to see if we have any recommendations or not.
Or do we just pass it on to council and tell
Yeah.
them that they need to look into this? I mean, not that I don't want to do this. I'm just,
no,
I feel like
think
this
we
is
have some
stuff they
valuable
need
input.
to, well, we do, but we also have a lot of other topics to discuss that are specifically zoning related.
Well, the thing that I think is the best one here on this list is the examining zoning ordinance that loosens things up to encourage more options. And I've seen multiple studies all over the country that the word is you cannot build your way out of this problem. You can't just keep building more apartments. And in Boston and New York and places like that, and LA, you know this as well because you read the American Planning Association magazines. The trend is to loosen up the regulations to allow accessory dwelling units and allow basement apartments in single-family zoning places. Like I live in whatever Green Mountain, I could rent out my basement. But right now, according to the zoning code, I cannot do that. I can't make a separate dwelling in my. I can.
Well, I will warn you, when we did accessory dwelling units, there was a relaxation of the code regarding accessory dwelling units with the zoning rewrite, and there was a lot of negative feedback that this was not a good idea, and people were worried about, you know, people are going to be renting out, you know, building these, you know, it's meant to have relatives in it, and they're gonna build them and rent them out, and everything's gonna deteriorate because of it, and there's gonna be a whole lot of this going on. Has there been any requests? 6. One of the major things that keeps a lot of people doing this is you need a separate, for most if not all the water districts, you need a separate, and you would know this, you need a separate water tap.
Okay.
And water taps are extremely expensive.
You have to dig up the driveway.
Well, no.
That's not the case. The water and sewer district that I'm a part of says it's a city rule,
Really?
not. Oh,
I thought it was a Denver water rule.
Not necessarily. In fact, Consolidated Mutual just last month changed their rules to allow an ADU on the same tap.
Consolidated Mutual is not, Denver Water doesn't dictate their,
Part of it.
yeah, but they're going to completely separate, that they're in the process of completely separating.
I guess what I was saying is that the district I'm a part of,
Do you get your water for Denver Water? And
Doesn't.
you allow it if it's a separate structure?
well, it's a building code thing, and so it doesn't even go through the water district.
Yeah, but you know, I'm engineer for another water district, and you know, whenever we talk about having a separate structure and having a water connection from the existing house to a separate structure, they always came back and said, no, you've got to have a separate tap.
structure is a different thing, I think, than having a basement built out or something.
Oh, no, a basement built out. Oh, no, yeah.
In general, though, the ADUs are, as a general rule, they don't say if it's an ADU, then you have to have a separate tap.
Oh, no, I'm talking about separate buildings.
So I think what I would add to this first one is that there was a comment or two about ADUs, and so maybe in terms of an aspect of affordable housing, it seems that a little bit more research about ADUs and
Update our ADU standards as well.
Is Rob correct that the current zoning code does not allow that?
No,
If it's in the house,
it's allowed, but however, because there was so much pushback, there are a lot of restrictions on it. You have to have a lot of 9,000 square feet or more. You're only allowed to do it at the unit itself can only be.
let's back up. Are we talking about the separate structures or
Either one.
either one?
Both. So we put a lot of restrictions on them. So that may be preventing some people from doing it, as in addition to the water tap situation. So we could re-examine it and maybe loosen up the ability to do them.
What about tiny houses too?
Here's what happens in reality, and in Boston and places in LA, is that people are doing it anyway, regardless of the regulations.
Yeah.
If there's enough pressure on the market and people want to rent out their basements and they want to make a buck on the side, they will do it. So you may as well wrap some code around it, and it'll create more housing opportunities. The people are going to be moving in here anyway. But the comments I'm hearing in Ward 4 particularly are, you know, stop building all these houses so that people won't come in here. Well, then people are complaining about the affordability of the houses, like for teachers and so on. So if you stop creating more housing opportunities, people are going to be moving here anyway. It's going to put more pressure on the market, and it's going to increase house prices.
Yep.
So that's what I'm.
We can certainly
there's
add an examination of ADUs to the list.
Ambiguity there.
Yeah.
Well, patio homes is one that, you know, for a long time, you know, involved in the development, there's people that looking for places to be able to have smaller homes that, you know, have a common an HOA take care of the property, so people who are, you know, at the point of their life where they, you know, they're not ready to go into assisted living or anything like that, but they want to move to a place that still has a lawn, but they don't have to take care of it.
I have a question about the couple of the items on the list. We're talking about the first one still, but I wanted to ask how we were distinguishing between the first and the third. It seems like there's a lot of
No, affordable housing, I think, was a separate subject than what we're talking about now. We skipped over 2.
So I was just asking staff how you were. So in the first one, affordable housing, did you mean the subsidized housing, that sort of thing?
Right. So tax credit projects. So
Okay.
so one of the issues is the requirements for tax credit projects and getting tax credits from the state often consolidate affordable projects in certain parts of town.
Mm-hmm.
And so are there things that the city can do to spread those around?
Okay. So then some of the things I was saying earlier that I didn't realize you were talking about subsidized housing. And so some of the things we're bringing up about ADUs seem like they're more appropriate to put in this third bullet.
Yes. Yes, that's what we were saying.
And yeah.
Okay.
Yes?
But
That
still,
was your understanding?
Yep. I just added it on my sheet as an additional one to examine the rules for ADUs. But yeah, we could put it under 3 or just add a new one.
We skipped over examine issues of unit limits on residential use. I mean, that's,
a question mark by that? I didn't know what you meant by that.
well, that's, well, go ahead.
Currently, our code in our mixed-use zones, in our residential multifamily zone, we limit the size of buildings, the height, the shape, and the open space. We don't put a cap on the number of units. So you can put as many units as you want in that envelope, but here's the envelope. And some people are saying, well, we should also have a unit cap. And so that's...
Yeah, those of us who work in the development community understand there really are limits to the number of units because all these other physical constraints limit the number of units that are allowed. But people have been using this for political purposes to say, oh, you can build as many units as you want. Well, you really can't. The other constraints in the ordinance prevent you from building more than whatever number as a matter of fact, most cities that have a maximum number, you can't come close to that maximum number because of the other constraints on setbacks and minimum minimum green space and all these other
That sounds like that we're kind of debating it already. I would just, if it makes sense to leave it on there, then let's leave it on there and talk about it. I was wondering if people meant the total number, like they don't like to have 40-unit apartment buildings, or it was not that we were thinking about.
Yeah, that's not I'm sure there are people that feel that. In fact, the initiative looks at that, but that's not what this was.
Okay. So I think we should just leave it on there.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I mean, that's one of the hot items I keep hearing, and even if it's just to look at it, and well, we'll have a lot to discuss about that when at the appropriate time.
So are we okay on the first 3?
I think so.
On number 3, if I could just say something about co-housing units. I know it says et cetera. Does something need to be added for co-housing units?
Consider it.
That's an interesting concept.
Are you
Yeah, so a friend of mine is moving into something like 72nd and Federal. So it's called the Aria, and so they share common space with kitchens and green space, and but they have their own apartments, their own condos, if you will, too, but some shared units as well. So just to make sure nothing is left out there.
call it communal living concepts?
Co-housing.
The commune
No.
where you grew up, that's different.
Oh, okay.
So,
Seriously, I had somebody approach me. They were looking for a place that, they could, they were looking for a place they could put a community. They have their own individual living units, but it's all owned by them jointly.
right.
And most places don't allow that. And to be honest, I'd like to see something, when we get to that point, I was going to suggest we look at, what are we doing, what constraints do we have that wouldn't allow that, and do we want to keep them?
Well, we actually had a variance case in front of us at one point where a gentleman wanted to put his family in a large house on a large lot, and where his disabled son could have a sort of a separate unit to himself. So we aren't very far from this. I think we were able to grant that one. But you're right.
It was a garage conversion.
Yeah, garage conversion. And yeah, if our present zoning ordinance impedes that sort of thing, we might examine it. In that case, it was a setback problem. So otherwise, you could have done it without coming to us. But I'm thinking of that, and you were talking about tiny homes. Tiny homes on tiny lots, I don't know how that would go in R16.
Well, I was wondering about that actually, too, about tiny homes. I assume that you were talking about the portable tiny homes, right?
Well,
No,
not
they're not
necessarily.
always portable.
Yeah.
I've seen it where they're just really small.
And sometimes expensive.
Yes, actually. But they can be permanently placed.
Would they fall under the rules of the accessory dwelling units then?
Depends. There's a couple ways they could be allowed now in our code. So our mixed-use neighborhood zone allows them in two ways. First, we don't have any maximum lot size, so you could cut up a bunch of 2,000 or 1,000 square foot lots and put tiny homes on them. But secondly, it also removes the standard that's in the residential zones of only one house per lot. So you could have a big 1 acre lot with 20 tiny homes on it, or 50 tiny homes on it.
You could currently in our...
In our current code. Yep.
Interesting.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's look at it more.
Okay,
Could I insert something here? Because when I saw this array of people, and from the people that I spoke to at our open house, one of the things that is beyond our control, really, is the rising values of homes and their cost. And I think that's driving the anxiety that is driving some of this. And I don't know that we can do much about it. Looking in the zone in the housing study, I noticed that housing that's close to Denver is rising in value, and that's significant because that was considered a somewhat decaying area about 10 years ago. So we've got something of a turnaround, but we also have kind of people kind of falling out of focus on this, especially when they look at multi-family developments. So I'll throw that out there. We can't do much about it, but we ought to be sensitive to it.
okay, ensure that zone districts allow multifamily housing, coordinate with approved growth areas in the comprehensive plan, and do not extend into single-family areas. Can you elaborate on what you meant there?
So some of the concerns were these new apartment buildings are creeping into our stable neighborhoods. So we've got that comp plan map that shows where the stable neighborhoods are and where the growth areas are. And we've got zoning that in some places allows multifamily buildings, in some places it doesn't. So the point of this is let's do a double check and make sure that that those match, and that we don't have zoning for multifamily structures in areas that are that are stable neighborhoods and not supposed to have that.
That seems reasonable.
Sounds good.
Yeah, of course, that can open a whole other can of worms. What do you do about it? Because people have invested in it based on that zoning, and
That's true.
then you're taking a right away from them and get into that whole issue. But
It's worthwhile.
I think there's enough concern about it, and I've noticed some things in some areas where, you know, I wonder what the thought process was of allowing denser residential in certain areas. And, you know, I guess what I'm saying is there are some legitimate complaints I've been hearing about that, but having it expand to be citywide is where I have a little bit of a problem. But I think that's exactly what we need to do. Look at and see what the problems are, and then when we identify them, figure out what we can do about it.
The good news is we're just handing these problems to the city council.
You know, I have.
We're
to say,
identifying them and saying, here you go.
I don't want, was going to
That's why you get the big bucks.
at the end of the presentation, you know, I can see that city council is somewhat baffled by this, and they're kind of throwing the whole thing at us, and yet we got to help where we can, you know. We're here for that purpose, at least to help as we can, and provide them the guidance and see if we can find ourselves out of this maze and help them.
Yeah, I see us, and maybe you disagree, but I see us as the group. Okay, you know, we us as a group, not the people sitting here now, but the planning commission have come up with zoning ordinances and a comp plan, and I think it's appropriate for us to take the input from the public that we've been hearing and try and make some sense of it in terms of what the current zoning code is, and look at, you know, hey, this is a problem, we could do this to fix it. Are we creating more problems by doing that? And then, you know, kind of be as technical and independent as we can be in looking at these issues, and let the elected officials deal with the people that are voting them and how much that gets input into the thing. I guess I'm saying we need to consider the public, but we should look at it more from a does it make sense point of view, technically or I don't know. Anybody disagree with that assessment? Okay. Anything to say about that item, or move on to the next one?
Move on.
Okay. Clarify issues of university housing located in single-family areas. Now that's a problem that has come up in one specific area. And,
Word one.
I don't. Was anyone else on the planning commission when that was brought before us? Am I the only one left from that? Well, that came to us, and this illustrates a problem that we have. When we, and I don't know if it's the notification requirements or what, but we had a hearing on this, and everybody testified positively about it. Nobody had any problems with it, and I was kind of expecting a lot, you know, at least some complaints, some things to consider why we shouldn't be doing this, but there was none, and we approved it, and now it's being implemented, and it's a big problem. So I'm not sure. I think this is a bigger issue than just the housing issue. You know, how do these things happen?
Well, and the issue here is not related necessarily to the plan development that was
Okay.
approved for the university. The issue here is the university purchasing properties outside of their plan development.
Oh, okay.
And,
Okay.
and housing students in them. And so there is
So there's people that think that's a zoning violation.
There are people that think that's a zoning violation. They think that housing owned by the university is student housing and therefore part of the campus and therefore not allowed. The university's position obviously is we bought it as a duplex. We're using it as a duplex. We can house 5 unrelated people in each half of the duplex. And so we need to clarify one way or the other.
Yeah, okay. So this item then is to look at the current ordinance, see if what's going on is in accordance with the ordinance.
It's less about enforcement of what's happening now and more about just clarifying the rules for everybody moving forward.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, we need to keep that.
But do we want to, I mean, part of whatever ordinance we come up with is, you know, do we need to change the ordinance or keep it the way it is so that this is allowed, or do we need to change the ordinance or keep it the way it is so it's not allowed?
Right. We need to change either way. We either need to change the wording to clarify, we either need to change the wording to clarify the current position that it's allowed, or change the wording to clarify a new position that it would not be allowed.
Okay. Moving on.
That's a tricky one.
Well, I'd say at least 50% of these are very tricky. If they weren't, we wouldn't be looking at them.
There is one other, maybe you could explain this just so the next time I'm asked about it. The big dormitory that's close to Alameda Avenue that was built, was completed about a year ago.
Yeah.
Does it fall within a mixed-use urban designation, do you know? And I should look at the zoning designation of that area.
Paul says,
But the fact that it's fairly close to Alameda Avenue,
yeah.
or Alameda Boulevard, rather, does that put it in that characteristic?
So Paul's saying that the underlying zoning on the campus is mixed use, employment, suburban. However, there's a PD, there's a plan development over the campus that defines where the buildings are going. So that is a very urban form, pulling the building up to the street and having a long street frontage there.
Or it seems close enough. Maybe it isn't. If you actually measure it, I'm just eyeballing it.
Yeah.
But it seems to look mixed use urban, but in fact it's suburban is the underlying.
The underlying zone, but the PD may change it enough to make it an urban feel there, because the PD sort of defines where the buildings are.
Was that a university decision to position it there?
Yes, if you kind of look at their campus, there was a series of apartments that were further back. So by bringing the building up, they were actually able to keep some of the existing housing stock while they built the new housing stock. So it was deliberate on the university's part. In fact, that building, I don't know if you've been on campus, is kind of L-shaped.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be another one. It's kind of twin to the east of that one. So you have the one here next to kind of the detention facility. There's another one that's being planned just east of that, where I think the church sat or still sits, because it's coming down. They acquired the church piece. They are expanding a little more quickly, I think, than they had anticipated, which is a good thing. So they're implementing their vision for that campus.
Okay. Thank you.
I was going to say what my wife says about that building every time we ride by it, but we're being recorded, so maybe. But that brings up another point. I do hear a lot of comments on, and I don't think this is the place to discuss it, but about the urban standards and the zero setbacks and where it's being applied, and I think at least some of those are legitimate. That doesn't fit here, but I think that's something we need to be looking at. Review school dedication requirements and process. That's, but I mean, they're also talking about the park fee assessment, and
Council is handling that now. Council's
Okay.
already looking at the park fees.
Okay.
That's not on your plate necessarily,
Okay.
but the school land can be.
okay.
I have a question about that. Do we have any areas that are large enough for a development to go in where where a developer would have to set aside land for a school?
The remaining Rooney Valley,
Rooney Valley is really all.
they're gonna
yeah.
require a school. Yeah, I'm not too sure of too many others, if there are.
Maybe on the Federal Center if that ever became.
So yeah, and in fact, one of the discussions that we had internally about park fees was, and maybe it's appropriate to have it as a school fee, is should we relook at these things? Historically, we've been a greenfield community, and our school land and our park land dedication were based on the assumption that we had big developments coming in. If we're now transitioning to an infill community that's built out, do we need to change the underlying assumption and assume there's not land and take money or take enough money to buy land somewhere else, or, should we change that assumption?
But that seems like, to me, like something worth looking at.
Yeah, because, I mean, the larger developments, they're required to dedicate land for this, and that's a separate issue, whether it's allowed for them to do fees in lieu of. But smaller developments, for them to pay their fair share, they don't have enough land to dedicate for these things. Maybe there should be some fee set aside for that. And even, one that comes to mind, you said, okay, they're covering the park fees. A lot of places have a traffic impact fee. And I think that's something we should look into also as a...
Yep. Because that is definitely one of the big topics, is traffic and infrastructure in general. I've heard a lot of concerns about water, which I realize is not a city thing, but with all the new development, I think a lot of people are just concerned that we're not considering the impact on the overall infrastructure.
Yeah, and I know this is beyond ordinance. This is something else if we decide to make a recommendation that whenever, I don't know if this is the area, this is the place where we put those things in, but somewhere.
Judging.
I actually was going to bring up traffic, kind of wasn't sure where it fits though, because it's kind of a general concern, obviously, but I guess I'd be curious, there is no requirement right now for developers to put together a traffic impact study individually is there, or what's the criteria? Or we should talk about that, not right now necessarily, but.
Right, and I don't know what the exact criteria is, but the city traffic engineer
requires that.
Will require them. We were requiring them with rezonings. That was always a standard.
Right.
Still is. But he also, if we have a site plan, and it's interesting, if you have an administrative process or a staff process, he still will require a traffic study, even if it's a small project and there's a problem area. So he's got criteria that he can make individual assessments and require the actual studies.
I figured there probably was.
But there have been claims that, hey, no, they don't require any traffic studies, and I don't know if that's because at the stage we hear things, there's no traffic study required, or whether that's. But I think it's important, if for no other reason, for us to understand when we're up here making decisions, what is the requirement? They keep saying, well, that's handled, at a later step. That's fine, but I think we need to understand what that later step is. And I don't know if that means, have the traffic engineer give us, come in at some point and give us a little discussion, because, that's an area we have complaints that I think are very legitimate. And I'm not saying the city is not addressing them properly, but I'm saying we really don't know. We have to rely on the expertise of people, and there are people who question the expertise of those people. So I think we need. Do you agree or no? Well, or do we just assume, okay, traffic will take care of it? We don't.
I agree with you.
I will say that after the umpteenth time that I heard about the Green Gables and the increase on traffic on Jewel, that I would ask the county for the traffic studies, and they very generously gave me the copious study. And I think it's easier for me to learn Urdu than to try to interpret those studies. I mean, you can spend a lot of time with them, and but
Right.
they're intricate. And it would be nice if the traffic people, when we do a rezoning, would come in and do some explanation.
I think Katie or I could look at it and make some sense of it, but I could understand how.
I was,
But, you know, I've seen enough in meetings where, you know, I don't have evidence for sure that, you know, they're not doing their job, but there have been a few things that come up where I question, you know, it doesn't seem exactly right, and there probably is a good explanation, but, you know, we're left here making a decision, and, you know, based on staff's gonna do this, and, you know, I scratch my head sometimes and think, how is it gonna be addressed?
I'd like to insert something. I've thought about reading all of this, and it kind of applies, because what you're talking about is educating us, and then, though I'd like to take it a step further. So all these comments are great, you know, we hear you, we got all these comments, but I think it would be really cool to then say, and here's what we're doing about it. And so just one little something, like looking at Lakewood or on the city website, you know, just have some things like, did you know, like the traffic division is the one that regulates street parking, for example, and this zoning ordinance regulates on, you know, just little blurbs here and there that can help educate the public after all that they've contributed, some of it well-founded, some of it not. And so just to take it a step further, to let them say, yeah, we heard you, and this is how we're interacting, and did you know, blah, blah, blah. So
Yeah, because I don't know if you've heard, but, you know, I've heard, and I know at least one other commissioner's heard people say, planning commission's not doing their job.
yeah, somebody said that to me in the King Supers parking lot. It's
Yeah.
like, hello.
And you know, we're a volunteer, and this is not full-time, we're volunteer, we all have lives, but we do have an obligation to, we have certain obligations, and I think, I think that's one of them, that we ought to have an answer when these questions come up. And it's, you know, right now the answer is, well, there's a procedure and staff looks at it. Maybe we need a little more than that. I don't know. But transportation and traffic is one of the things that, you know, and I've mentioned before, I want to make sure is in the discussion. And whether it comes up as part of some of these other discussions, or when we get to the end, I might say, I want to have a completely separate meeting on traffic, but that's,
It's definitely a big one.
yes.
But it's not zoning.
It's not.
No, it's not, but it's transportation planning. It's planning.
I want to make a comment about that too, though. I think it's good for us to talk about it, and people do bring it up. What I haven't heard though is us putting some sort of a boundary on what it is that we want to know. What do we want to know?
Well, I think at least from my perspective, it's like a lot of people have concerns, like when you're putting in a 300 unit residential development, like what is that going to do? And it's not that it's not being done, but it's just that it's not being presented necessarily in advance. So, I mean, and if they're not rezoning, it's not going to come before us anyway. But I do think that for some of the presentations, I mean, I've done presentations on the other end where we've had the traffic engineer come in and present to council and to the commission what the traffic impact's going to be. So that would be my only thought, would be to.
Well, I would like to look at it from a perspective. Traffic is a problem, comes up everything.
Yeah.
You know, very few things come before us where traffic's not an issue. And then you hear a lot that, well, traffic is what it is and there's not much you can do about it. Well, there are things you can do about it. Now, some of them may cost money, but I mean, transportation planning is a part of planning, and there is a science there, and there are things that can be done to help with traffic, alleviate traffic, and some of them relate to alternate forms of transportation, and some of them relate to certain things you can do with your street system or roads in certain areas, or signal timing, or I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things that can be done, and some of them are being done right now, but I'm not sure it's being planned, and if it is, great, I'd like to hear it, but that's something we really need to look at.
I still don't know what, though, I mean, it sounds like it's a huge thing. It sounds like we're talking about a traffic study for the whole city.
Well,
And
maybe that's what needs to be done, but, you know, there's a cost there, and city council's gonna have to, you know, they have a lot of different priorities when they look at the budget, but, you know, for at least us to at least not be talking about traffic somewhere in the mix,
I'm not saying we
I
should
think
be talking about traffic. I'm not saying that. I'm not getting a sense of what it is that we want staff to research, because that's what the recommendation section, we're adding things that we want them to research and bring to us so we can talk about, I guess. So I'm just
Impact of traffic on from housing developments, is that what you want to add here?
I think from any development, it applies to commercial development, it applies to any type of development. What the hot issue now is residential.
Right. But we're talking
Yeah, and in this area, we're talking about housing.
Well,
But what I'm talking about transcends, you know, the housing or mixed use or whatever.
so it sounds like what you're saying then is that you want for them to bring to us what are the criteria, the standards, the expectations.
Exactly what it means, I don't know. I think we need to talk about it, is what I'm saying. And, you know, if the consensus is, well, it's none of our business because others handle that, I can accept that. But I do want to make a pitch that we somehow, when we're through this list, somehow we're looking at traffic and transportation.
Well, I think, I wasn't going to say this, but I believe it's worth pointing out that at least one council candidate is going to do something about congestion. And I don't want to say ironically, you know, maybe we should have invited him, but he is invited. He obviously could have attended as a citizen. But it's an issue that's out there, and I think we have to take our part of it.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's you know, it's a political issue. I don't want to get into that. I want to make sure we're meeting our responsibility as a planning commission to make sure that what is being done in this city is what should be done in this area.
It sounds like maybe we're talking about adding a sixth area.
Maybe when we get through, if that's kind of what I've been suggesting all along, but maybe it can be brought into some of these other areas. But that's what I'd like to discuss when we get through this. So we've been through the housing items. Is there anything else to add other than what we've talked about so far?
We're going to talk about mixed use in another.
Yeah, that's the next one.
So my notes are, we will keep the recommendations as is and add ADUs and co-housing. Okay, thank you.
And I thought we were adding impact of traffic from housing.
No, that's, we may insert that, but let's get through and see where.
We're okay with the school dedication process?
Yes.
Okay.
Again, that's a bigger, that, you know, there could be larger areas and ones being addressed, but, you know, but yes, that's in there. And we'll discuss further at the appropriate time. So mixed use, I'd like to start out, I've heard, I mean, this is an area where there have been claims out there that the city right now is not following its own code. And so there are two parts of this. One is, it relates to what a mixed-use zone is and what should be required in a mixed-use zone. The claim is that single use and mostly high-density residential is being built in mixed-use zone without any element of commercial and or other uses that are permitted in the mixed-use zone.
And the intent of the description of the mixed-use zone in the ordinance is, the ideal scenario, and then you have that array or matrix that says P or no P, permitted or not permitted, and it's just a simple, like, kind of spreadsheet thing. I think that's a bad idea. We need to get rid of that, because it's
Get rid of the spreadsheet or get rid of
when you read the description of what a mixed-use zone is, it doesn't seem to jive with that matrix. That's what I'm hearing as a huge complaint.
There's a part of the ordinance that discuss what a mixed-use zone is, and then there's a part of the ordinance which actually is the regulation.
They don't jive.
And the explanation of what a mixed use, the intent of a mixed use zone is to have the mixes of uses that are presented in that zone. And but our ordinance, the way I understand it, is written that these are uses that are permitted, although there's a couple of cases where the use is called an ancillary use, and people interpret that to mean, well, that's a secondary use and you need to have the primary use in there, and maybe you can have some of this. That needs to be clarified, and when in the process to clarify it, this is a very sensitive issue, because there are people that want us to clarify that say a mixed-use zone means everything that's built in there has to be mixed use. In practical terms, and I think you would agree with me, that's not possible, unless everything done within a mixed-use zone is a planned development and done by a large developer. And I would like to see small businesses and small developers being involved in this process. And, that may mean a single use within the zone, as long as it fits so that the whole
Neighborhood.
is a mixed use. And that's something that the zone does not cover at this point. And I'm not sure there is a way to do it, but I'd certainly like to exhaust all possibilities to see if there's a way we could do that, short of having a planned development.
Big complaint is that housing is being pushed into mixed-use zones, and large multifamily residences and they're kind of skirting around the ordinance to avoid putting in a certain amount of open space, etc. I keep hearing it over and over and over again. And then there's no other facilities being put in there to go along with the mix.
And
it's like invented. These apartment buildings are invented for single people only, and they're not. Well, whatever. There's not enough open space, etc. Not enough shopping to walk to, etc. So it's car dependent.
It looks to me like the recommendations actually cover both of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they
do.
Yeah,
from
review.
what I'm hearing you guys say, I don't think.
Second bullet, review and clarify mixed-use standards. I just add the word clarify. I heard Henry use that. So, is the mixed use within one building or within the area, so.
You know,
So in terms of what kind of research we'd want you to bring to us for this one, I don't know. I would like to know, I guess we could drive around and look, and I have my own thoughts, but that's not very scientific. And so if you could bring some kind of, I don't know, some data about how mixed use zones have been used, that seems like that would be helpful to us. I know that we hear things and we kind of feel things and we see things, but it isn't necessarily following the data and what's actually happening. Does that seem reasonable?
Are there places that have an ordinance, and what is that ordinance that does truly have mixed use without requiring it for each individual unit? I don't know if there is.
Yeah.
You know, nothing, mixed use, the whole mixed use controversy and what I'm hearing from people is very hard for me to get my arms around. And it's somewhat beyond my personal experience in terms of just getting the context of it. Because I've heard from both small business owners who say there's all this residential coming in and there's not enough commercial to serve it directly. And then on the other hand, I hear that throughout the metropolitan area, there's too much retail space, which I recognize is only one part of commercial activity. And then again, in sitting on this commission too, I've observed some pressure when we've allowed some of these storage units to come in, that we want them to include some retail space also. And the expectations of, and the complaints of people who saying, no, it's not really mixed use, it's all residential. And I'm trying to figure out where the friction and the disconnect is, because it's difficult for me to grasp it. And then what should we require? You know, if we require that a certain amount of retail space be at ground level, then what if we have too much retail space? I see that already in Denver in some of the street level building that's been done. The retail space is vacant, at least right now it is.
And part of the reason, I mean, well, we're kind of moving away from actual stores to online retail much more so, which is something like, you know, requiring someone to put in a retail space in a residential building. There's no guarantee they're going to need that in the future.
Well, a lot of it has to do is in general, in what I observe and what I hear in the development community is yes, there is more commercial than the residents can support, region-wide. But that doesn't mean individual places. Now, Solterra's an area where, you know, it needs more commercial. Yeah. And that's where Union has a lot of office space. It has a lot of employment. It has a lot of retail, and so whether I really want to see how that works out. But to me, I understand the theory that you need more residences, and if you bring in people. If there's a place for people who work at the hospital can move into, that may, everybody does that may eliminate a car on 6th Avenue or along Wadsworth, and I mean that's the theory. In reality, let's see what happens. But I understand why. In that case, you don't necessarily have to have a commercial component with that. And maybe it would have been nice to have it on the ground floor and require it, but the current zone didn't require that. But I hate to see every single building.
I don't know that that's what that's why I say I don't get that, because I don't see that, and that's why I was saying that I think we could better discuss it when we have some data. It'd be interesting to know the developments that have come in under the mixed use zone, and you know, I don't know how hard that is to collect, or if you can collect. I think some places like Solterra aren't actually, wasn't that a planned development, so it's not really in the mixed use zone, is that correct?
It's MES, but it wasn't zoned as a planned development? Or built as a planned development?
It was a plan development.
Originally, yeah.
The underlying is PD, I
Okay.
believe, and then most
So-
of it.
Yeah. So I think that bringing the data and then having this discussion, that's all I would need.
Okay, I mean, I think that's the core issue with mixed use, and if I'm missing something, if there's anything else we should really be discussing as far as mixed use, I'd like to hear it. Otherwise, I'd like to move on to the next subject area, which is site design and community context. If nobody has any initial thoughts, I'll just start going through the list then again.
Mm-hmm.
Research ways to encourage, incentivize amenities usable by pedestrians. Now this touches into the traffic issue, and one of the things that could help alleviate it, but
I think there's a lot of them that we've been talking about that touch on the traffic, you know, the bicycle usage and
but you are looking at this. You're looking at zoning changes to require pedestrian amenities, or I mean, is that primarily what you're talking about, or?
Yeah.
Okay. The next one: review and propose changes to height transition requirements. That's again that's one of the complaints we hear all the time. That I know there is a transition zone between commercial and residential, but I guess there is not one between high density residential and lower density residential.
Yes, there is. Is that
There is?
No, you're correct. There's a transition from mixed use to residential, but not from residential multifamily to residential single family.
And this primarily will look at that issue, correct?
That issue, yep.
Would it also look at, and I might be getting ahead of myself on that one, but the single family homes, because I know there have been some complaints that I've heard about, like very large house being built next to a very small house in a single family development. And I've spoken to people who are very concerned about kind of the same thing that's been happening in Denver, where you end up with these big houses that kind of take over the neighbor's yard just by blocking all the light and kind of being much larger than the neighboring house. So that would be something I'd want to look into as well.
That's another issue. We can add it to the list.
Yeah.
If that's
Yeah, and you know, that's again, it's another tough one, because you as a property owner, you know, you have certain restrictions of what you can do in your house, and some people want to take that to the max. You know, they want a super garage, or they want to, you know, and, you know, should they have the right to do that, or should the neighborhood be able to dictate what they can and can't do?
Yeah, and it's a tough one because that is, I mean, it kind of varies depending on the neighborhood a little bit, but so I don't know how but I guess I'd just be interested in talking about that a little bit more.
I would too. That sounds.
Because we're definitely moving that direction right now. Because Denver's filling up, so they're going to start moving out to Lakewood now next.
I may have missed this somewhere along the way, but the urban-suburban context, I don't want to completely get away from the occasional comment we heard about streets turning into canyons with a sudden height on both sides. And I know it's kind of an ephemeral thing. It's difficult to express also, but it did come up enough time that we ought to look into it. I think some people who have walked into Belmar have been startled by that. I think people who live there seem to like it okay, but there have been some criticism of it, and maybe we ought to take a look at it in terms of maybe more sensitivity to where you can have a canyon and where it's inappropriate.
Maybe this is addressed on the next section,
Yeah, I may be
architectural
getting
design. yeah.
Architectural design.
Right.
I may be ahead of myself on that.
This
It's in,
section
it's
right
in
now,
here, yeah.
Number 3 on this is that issue.
Yeah, that, I mean, this is an area where I feel strongly that, we need to be careful when we make an ordinance change. It applies citywide. And, you know, there obviously is a need for the Belmar type development with the canyon effect. And, but that doesn't mean that should be applied to Green Mountain or some of these other areas where people are concerned about it. I think we're a diverse city, you know. We go from the urbanized border with Denver, and then the other side of the city's starting to get in the foothills, and
But I think it'd be good to look at
yeah.
that number 3, definitely with the bulk plane, especially and build to requirements, just because especially the Beacon seems to be the hot one that everybody is pretty upset about, and how close it is to Union. So I don't personally mind it, but but I know a lot of people do.
That's been an ongoing puzzle. Some of the business owners don't like it for some reason, and the people who live in Ward 4, who are probably live in the single-family detached, think it's some kind of a horrible structure. But when I look at it and drive around it, it seems to be pretty suitable in terms of its context. And someone who saw the original Union development back in the 1970s, when I did sit on another authority of the city, you know, it's been under development ever since then. And it seems to be exactly where it should be. And it's left me thinking, you know, this is where the planners went one direction, and some, you know, undefined audience of people don't like it.
Is there, I mean, right now these things are controlled by what zone they're in. Is there any way to, you know, make geographic specific requirements?
The site design is really controlled by the context, that S or T or U, suburban urban transit. So in transit, we pull buildings all the way up to the front, and Union around near Federal Center is largely transit context. In the urban context, it's a mix. In the suburban, buildings can go all the way back. So that's exactly what we try to do in the new code is create geographic areas where buildings should be up to the street, buildings should be further back.
So the way to control that is maybe a change in a zone.
If there's a problem, it's less
if there's
about changing the standards. It's more about changing the map. And
Yeah,
where the T's
yeah.
and the U's are.
Yeah, should this property, is this project zone, what its zone, is that proper for the area? Yeah.
So maybe, we could certainly do.
But
that.
again, the property right issues has to
Yeah.
be considered.
What
But
about under site design, the big complaint about these apartments and so on, that there's no amenities, there's nowhere to walk their dog. They're skirting around their open space requirements by putting a courtyard instead of a green park or something on the lot. Does that fit under site design? And have we covered that, because it's a massive complaint?
Absolutely, we can and we should. One of the things may be what counts as open space. Yeah, does open
Small
space
parks. I'm talking about like small parks to walk a dog, or a playground next to a big apartment building. Because in Union there is nothing there. It's becoming like a concrete jungle, is what the complaint is.
I think that's the intent of number 1 and the
Okay.
recommendations is amenities.
Amenities. Okay, we're good.
So we can look at that.
Yep.
We'll bring you some recommendations.
Okay.
I think the plaza, and it's not green space, but the plaza at Belmar is fantastic. I mean, it kind of puts you in the mind of some of these European type plazas.
But there's no small parks in that Belmar area.
But yeah, there's a lot of complaints. There's no place to walk your dog, and well,
nowhere to play.
is that something that? Yeah, how do you know? It's tough enough to figure out how to address the park, open, the park in lieu of, and the school dedication in lieu of. Do we have doggy park, dedication fee? This, I'm being a little facetious that, where does it stop? Where does it end? I mean, people have their own.
Well-designed cities have neighborhood parks all
Right.
over the city.
I agree. There should be more and better dog
They don't have
parks.
to be big parks. They can
And
Right.
playgrounds.
Exactly.
And playgrounds too, because it was the dog parks and the playground for Belmar, I think were the two that were missing
Yeah.
in that design.
But again, that was a planned development, as you know. Planned developments set their own standards, and is there a way to put in there that planned developments? There's not going to be very many more, so maybe it's not even worth looking into. But I mean,
Well, areas of the city in the long run are going to be renewed from periods of time. We have some space requirements already, don't we, for PDs and mixed use?
We have
Um,
open space
Yeah,
requirements.
open space requirement. We could expand them. It's, there's a vanishing point there in terms of doing a development because, but
There's also a lot of latitude and maybe too much latitude in how you can use open space and what
That's
you can
right.
count as open space. So that may be something we can look
there's
at.
some,
as well.
there's a compensatory device there too, in terms of park,
You-
payment.
you might look at Westminster, or not, Wheat Ridge's current standard, because they have standards on the amount of green space, on the amount of what they call usable open space, and they have different requirements for. I think there's 3 or 4 different categories of open space, and they have to have minimums of certain. Take a look at that. I'm sure there's other examples, but I know Wheat Ridge has it doesn't. We might have to add a doggy park, but
It doesn't have to be a dog. It can just be green space. I mean,
well, I've heard specific complaints that
Yeah.
Belmar needs, and if you have urban, you really, I mean, seriously, you need to look at things like dog parks if you have another Belmar type development.
Interestingly, the other large residential structure that's gone up on Van Gordon, that's near the VA office building. When I took a view of it, there were signs on the VA parking lot is keep your pet in your own, don't take it beyond into the VA parking lot. In other words, it's already, I can see Travis smiling. It's already become a problem in that area too. So dogs and pets is something we're gonna have to encounter at some point.
So do we like all of these on this list? Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Sustainable requirements,
Mm-hmm.
sidewalk and streetscape requirements. Those are the 2 that we haven't specifically talked about, but do we agree that staff should be looking at these?
Yes.
Is there anything else? We'll keep transportation aside until the end.
On this one.
I've added on single-family home heights onto this list.
Right.
If I can say something about sidewalk and streetscape, I do notice that some of the older suburban type configurations, probably using the wrong word, don't necessarily have pedestrian egress that's easy. You have to walk to a nearby driveway. We might take a look at that on suburban, what's the urban-suburban dichotomy? But the suburban ones that have parking lots in front often don't have a really appropriate pedestrian egress. And I'm surprised that that occurs, because you would think the store owners would have, and the mall owners would invite a certain amount of pedestrian and perhaps bicycle egress, and yet sometimes you just have to walk around, or you have to go over a barrier or over a dip of some kind.
Okay, the last item is architectural regulations, and that's one that, on the one hand, you know, we may want a little more uniformity in how things are done, you know, and have more of an identity as a city, or this is where you could have more tasteful design of buildings, because there's a lot of complaints about the ugliness of buildings, although that's, you know, that's the eye of the beholder, and this is where you gotta try and figure out how to use the input we get from the people, because one of the places they said is poorly designed is 2045 Newcomb Drive.
Is that your house?
And no. that's I think that's in Ward 1. And one of the examples of a well-designed building is 2045 Newcomb Drive. And so
Belmar is good design and bad.
yes. And so, I mean, this points to what I see attracts a lot of people to Lakewood, and attracted me to Lakewood is the diversity of these sorts of things. So if we look at architectural design, I think we do need to consider the different, you know, we got to make sure whatever we come up with applies to Ward 2 and Ward 4, for example.
When I was reading the comments, I didn't get the sense people were talking about houses so much as they were commercial buildings, the big boxes and that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, I think that's the bulk of what the discussion. Well, I didn't even know what's at 2045 Newcomb Drive. Is that a single family house?
My house. Some people love it. Some people hate it.
Yeah.
I actually have a comment about one of these. So I like the first part. I think we should look into that. The second one, research and propose sustainability requirements for site design. Isn't that the same as the one that's in the site design section?
This should say building design. So, sorry.
Oh, for building design.
That was a typo, yep. So
Okay.
the previous one's site design, this one should be building.
So I think that's a good idea here too.
Is it, rather than architectural regulations, what about an architect for the city?
Mm-hmm.
That's something we'll look at, either that and or some sort of design review committee
Right.
of private citizens. Those are both possibilities.
Don't we need some professional standards for architecture in here?
So, yeah, I mean, if you had a design review committee, we'd certainly have to have some design guidelines. We could put those together perhaps without an architect on staff, but with the help of architects. I think, yeah, you either have an architect on staff to review things based on a set of guidelines, or you have a body of citizens that reviews things based on.
Yeah, I would agree with the body of citizens, as long as we have at least one architect on that.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we have architects in the city.
Okay. But there's
One of
no
them's running.
architects, airport architects, there's whole field
Yeah.
architects.
They all
That's
have the
true.
training, though. They do all have the training to learn the basics of architecture.
And is this a volunteer committee? Like when you say a citizens committee or something?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's, I'm saying one possibility is to hire an architect, but there's cost involved with that, and there's less cost involved with an architectural committee, and that may be
Like a voluntary board?
yeah, that may be a compromise that we'd have to come up with, other than the, but I definitely could see the,
Do other cities our size have architects?
I would hope you would look into that also.
I've been kind of pushing on that for a while.
Yeah, many cities do have urban designers on staff, not
Okay.
necessarily architects, but yeah, we'll certainly provide you some research on that.
Isn't, considering the age of some of the houses in Lakewood, is this something that normally we would have the historic Lakewood people be a part of or have input on?
My suspicion is that any solution that comes out is going to be geographically contextual. So I don't foresee design guidelines citywide. I foresee design guidelines for Colfax and design guidelines for neighborhood X, and an architect or a body that reviews the design guidelines for the specific area.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay.
Kind of like the neighborhood plan's only specific to architecture. Yes?
Yes. Like an architectural zoning map or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, and again, you could look at Wheat Ridge, because Wheat Ridge has some pretty strict architectural standards. They have an architectural, I forget what they call it, but it's architectural guidelines, and they recently updated it, and it's, some of us might think it goes overboard, but it's definitely something that if we implemented something like that in Lakewood, I think Rob would be happy.
Okay.
But that's something for further discussion. Okay, we've been here 2 hours, and I was hoping the last half hour would be to kind of discuss priorities. I think the way this ended up a little different than I anticipated. We kind of discussed a lot of that as we did each item. But the first question I have, based on what you've been asked to do, which of these probably needs more time than, or the most amount of time, or which of these do you need more than a couple weeks to prepare for? Is the next meeting scheduled for a couple weeks from now?
Well, and I was just going to say, we did talk about doing a first meeting on November 8th. I'm not sure that there's any of these that we can turn around in a week, because we have to have a packet to you for the November 8th meeting by next Wednesday. I'm not sure there's any of these that we can turn around that fast. So we may want to look at November 15th if there's not a great hurry. November 15th being the first meeting session out.
There is a hurry. I think the city council and the public says there is a hurry, but not at the expense of missing something. So I don't know. You've all heard the same things that I heard about the prioritization of all this.
Demands on us are so global, putting it into a concise form is going to take some time.
Well, I mean, there's elements in the city that think we're just wasting our time. The decisions are obvious, and this is all.
Can we just get those developers in here to tell us what to do?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But what is the some of these might take 2 months to study, come up with the proper. I don't know what's the best. I kind of agree that 2 weeks might be a little tight, but we might get some criticism that we're moving too slowly.
I personally don't care about that kind of criticism. If you do it right, it takes. I remember the other things that we have done, like the rewriting of the zoning. You were part of that too.
Right.
Took us, whatever that took, 12 years, I think.
The people who are being very vocal right now are alert and attuned to what's going on. Conversely, we got to, it's like you said initially, we have to think about a lot of other people who are going to be affected, who might become vocal if we make a misstep.
That's going to happen. When we were going through the zoning ordinance, one of the real hot topics was was bees and goats and chickens.
Oh,
And
days.
there were a lot of people, that came out and said this is going to be the worst thing in the world if we start allowing these things in residential properties. And so we came up with a process, a special use process that the people had to go through in order before they can have these things. And we found out very quickly, why are we doing this? And we got rid of that requirement. So I want to avoid coming up with something that solves the problem of a few people, but creates a problem for a lot more people. And that takes a little time, so.
So it sounds like we're gonna wait 2 weeks and we'll just go at these. To me, I would suggest that we don't care about the order because we're gonna have to do them all anyway. Whichever one can be researched the most quickly. Let's do it
Well,
first, and then let's do the next.
We have to advertise a little bit, I think, at least for the first one. I would like to set an order that maybe at the next meeting we adjust a little bit if we have to, but I would like to kind of set a plan.
I can recommend maybe the first two, the two that I think we can complete the research the quickest, if that would help.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that mixed use followed by architectural design might be the first two that we could turn around the fastest.
Now, the question is, can they be combined in the first meeting, or do you think there's enough to talk about in each issue that,
Depends on when the first meeting is. If we're still talking about November 15th as the first meeting, I don't want to push too hard because we have 2 weeks until we have to get you a packet.
so maybe possibly if we put off the first meeting 2 weeks instead of 1 week, then maybe we could do the two, but.
I think we'd have enough of a conversation just talking
Okay.
about mixed use personally for one meeting.
Okay, which one?
I feel like that's going to be kind of a long conversation.
I agree, but I just wanted to throw it out there that,
Because it overlaps into other things too.
Right.
So why don't we try to bring you mixed use on November 15th?
okay?
Okay.
And then the following week, Thanksgiving, so we skip that and go to November 29th. We'll bring you architectural design.
Is the architectural design gonna take you longer to research than?
My estimate right now is that it's going to take longer than mixed use, but less long than the other.
Okay,
And if things change, we'll report to you on the 15th.
so I think what I'm hearing is we should have a separate, there are none of these we should combine.
I think we should because we don't want to have any 3-hour meetings or 4-hour meetings. I think
Well, before
we
we,
want to limit it, I think, to less than 2.
before we, go any further with this schedule, we're to the end. Where does traffic fit in all this? Traffic or transportation planning?
And what's our assignment? Is our assignment just to bring you an education session on how traffic is reviewed by the city? That's fairly easy. We could keep the November 1st meeting and do that, perhaps.
Why don't we do that, and then we can that'll be a good place to start.
Okay, let's do that, and then based on that presentation, we'll decide if we want to tack on more on transportation at later on or at the end of this. No? Yes? No?
And before I promise you,
You look
we'll have to talk to staff to make sure that traffic staff is available.
Right.
In theory, we could even add that on to, we've already advertised next week's meeting, right?
No, not next week's meeting. How long do you think the public hearing should be on that? They're not controversial, are they?
It's kind of interesting, the variance request you brought up with parents wanting to keep their adult child at home. It's the same property owner. It shouldn't be significantly long. I'm thinking if there's not a lot of neighbor input, we should be done in a half an hour, 45 minutes tops.
Of course, I've gone to meetings where I thought that was the case, and they went 3 or 4 hours, but that gives me some idea. So we would have time to discuss part 2 of that. Yeah, next week's meeting will be about, it'll be a Board of Adjustments meeting to discuss that case, and then we'll adjourn that, and then have a Planning Commission meeting to
What we found out is actually a waiver, so it's planning commission the entire evening, so we won't have to.
Oh, it's a special use? It's not a,
Yeah, it's a waiver, not
or a waiver, okay.
So it's designed.
What night is that again?
Next Wednesday.
Oh, next Wednesday, a waiver. Do we have a packet tonight? Okay.
But the second half of the meeting then will be a discussion of whether we want to take a position on the pending 1% limited growth initiative. And you will be coming with information that, you know, indicating what actually is in that, or
Like, come with a summary, a Reader's Digest version of the written.
yeah, is that something you could do, or?
For next week, yeah.
And do you have any updates tonight, that latest?
No, I don't remember what the update was at the retreat, but I believe it's the same. It's in court. So the protest was denied by the city clerk, and the protesters appealed that decision to district court. And so there is an indeterminate amount of time that the district court will consider that appeal, could be months. And when that happens, if the district court upholds the denial by the clerk of the protest, then it can go to council and go to a vote of the people.
And just because we're discussing it doesn't mean we have to come up with a you know, a position on it. But I think it's hot enough, and planning and the Planning Commission is affected enough that we ought to at least talk about it.
It's going to give us some new things to do.
Yeah, because there's, and I intend to read it between now and then also, but
Yeah, good luck.
Yes.
I know, I know.
Oh, and by the way, I see you still are only getting 18 FTEs under the new city budget. Do we need to lobby for some more staff for you, maybe? Could you use maybe 30 FTEs?
Well, everybody's in the same boat. The cities, especially this year with the Colorado Mills Mall and all the revenue the city lost, it's not a good year to be adding staff. But we can talk about it again next year.
How will you be publishing the plan that we've just discussed, or maybe just November 1st's plan?
No, November 1st is a
Oh, so in November,
8th.
yeah, November 15th, sorry.
November 8th. We're back to, we're going to have a November 8th meeting to discuss traffic.
Okay.
Oh, we are.
Yes.
Well,
If staff is available.
yeah, we'll see if we can get staff to come on November 8th to talk about the process for reviewing traffic.
Yeah, and what is the how much before the meeting does this have to be advertised? Is it 1 week, or is it 10 days, or?
We advertise like 13 days in your hub, but it's also on the website and posted in both atriums. And the November 8th meeting has already been published for.
Oh, we don't have an agenda, though.
No, you don't have to publish an agenda. I just posted an agenda on the board.
When do you need to post an agenda? The night before?
Technically, all the study sessions, those time requirements don't apply. So as long as we have an agenda or some kind of notice 24 hours before the meeting,
Okay.
we're in compliance with the code. What we're trying to do is we're trying to use the website, the Lakewood Development Dialogue, as well as Diane has mentioned, we're trying to publish these. And they're kind of generic. When we've sent the notice in the newspaper, we didn't know the order or the topic, so it's just kind of following up on the open houses for the Lakewood Development Dialogue. So we can get more specific as we get more direction.
Yeah, I would like you to have a schedule that shows November 8th. We'll discuss traffic if they're available. Once you determine that, and it's going to be a meeting, include that in the schedule. Then November 15th, mixed use. Then I want to give as much advance notice on these things as we can. And then November 29th, architectural. So we have 3 more. And then we have December.
So what I could do is we could meet with staff internally tomorrow or later this week and talk about the last 3, set an amount of work that we think each of those will take, and then maybe at next week's meeting, update you with an order for those last 3 and a timeline.
Yeah, unless there's a strong desire from anybody up here to say, well, we need to talk about such and such next.
No,
We
I
need
think
time, I think.
whatever.
Figure it
they-
out. That's
yeah.
I think that's more important, but
We'll do that. We'll update you next week with a schedule for those last 3 then.
okay.
All right?
Is city council pushing on this any?
City council's distracted right now with their own, with the election, so it's sort of they've got their own stuff going on, and once the new council comes in, it takes a couple of months for the new to settle in, right? So I don't expect that anybody's going to be pushing on us until next year.
Well, I'm sure 1 or 2 of them are going to come in saying, we need to do this tomorrow, and but realistically, you're right. The new city council doesn't, they don't start looking at things like this usually into January. Right. And I think with our schedule, unless in some of these meetings we say, okay, we need an additional meeting to discuss these things, January, we probably should be ready for some public hearings.
Yeah, we'll probably the last study session will be in January, and then we'll be able to go on into public hearings and combine them.
The departing council, the last meeting of the departing council has taken place now, hasn't it?
No, they meet next Monday.
Mhm.
In
Oh,
fact, they approved the budget next Monday.
Oh,
We've gotta
okay,
meet
that's
one
the final hearing on the budget then also.
That's the final hearing on the budget and the final meeting of the sitting council.
Okay.
Are they required to pass the budget at that meeting, or can they put it off to the next council?
No, they have to pass it by November.
Okay, good.
Right, they have to certify the mill levy
Hmm.
and
Yep.
all those other good things.
Okay. I guess by the November 8th meeting, we'll know more about the direction the city's going to take.
Thanks for putting all this together. It's a lot of type. Did you do all that typing?
Well, I found it baffling to summarize some of these comments, and I appreciate it too.
Well, that's one of the things that,
Was it Travis, really? You typed all that?
You did that huge memo?
well, you didn't really, I mean, you pretty much put them in as they were reported. You didn't edit. I mean, there obviously was one guy that said nope to everything. And what we're supposed to make of that, I don't know. I think that was a comment that we're not doing our job, and they know better what needs to be done, so I don't know.
I think it would be good to give it to them to show them we're making some headway.
And yeah, we can give it to them now. They'll certainly get all these comments when the things go to them as well for the decision. They'll get these
I
comments
think
then
we should
too.
wait because they're thinking about other things right now, the election and all
Mhm.
other things.
Yeah,
And
Let's
some of
give
them
it-
are leaving.
let's give it to the new council at the appropriate time. Are we still being recorded? Okay. I think, well, this is a study session. We don't really need to adjourn it, so I think, but I think we're done.